And this is a panel that brings together the culmination of a lot of the dialogue we've had around technology innovation requires social innovation, which ultimately requires money. And most of our cities just don't have enough of it. And we've been talking about this for several years now. We've been living it with our projects. Impossible very often to get the feds, the province, the cities to align their funding, whether it's climate action funding or any other kind of funding, infrastructure, transportation. So given that impossibility, is there a better way, a faster way, a quicker way to get these initiatives out the door to create low carbon smart mobility? This is a panel focused on what we call at QTRIC Innovation P3s. I think we've copyrighted the term, though we haven't trademarked it just yet. So it's our idea that this big bad beast of a public-private partnership, whatever it is, could be modified to really fit the needs of cities to make sure taxpayers get the biggest bang for their buck and get these low-carbon smart mobility projects out the door quicker and faster. The subtitle of the panel is Innovative Financing for Design, Build, Finance, Operate, and Maintain for Full Fleet Transit Electrification and Allied Projects. With that, I'd like to invite our panelists to the floor. First, Michael Legit, a partner at Denton's. Many of you are familiar with Michael. He has been honorary legal counsel for QTRIC for the last 4 years, also honorary legal counsel for OPTA, the Ontario Public Transit Association, and for CUDA, the Canadian Urban Transit Association. I think you got a monopoly on it, Michael, and so I think we all benefit from your honorary legal counsel. He also sits on the board of directors and is on the executive committee of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships, so a lot of experience coming to the floor there. Secondly, I'd like to invite Doug Parker to the stage. He's Senior Practice Lead in Transit Technology for IBI Group, and with loads of experience, nearly 30 years of experience in advanced technology and transit technology, we've asked Doug to come to the table here with dialogues that are occurring at his corporation and around town on the new innovative financing models needed to get the money out the door for these initiatives. And last but not least, Jeffrey Berger, Product Financing Solution Partner at Siemens Financial Services. Siemens has been one of our great partners on the technology front. We're now hoping to make them a great partner on the financing front. And towards that goal, I should note that we've currently been initiating these innovative P3 dialogues with a lot of our manufacturers, from New Flyer to Proterra to ABB Group. Seems like everybody now has a financial solution, or they're trying to come up with a financial solution. And manufacturers that used to be metal benders or just the producers of goods and services now have some kind of financial solution packaged into that good or service. So this is the intention of the panel today, to go through how do we actually get all this great technology out the door, and what are some of the innovative ways in which that can occur. So to start things off, I'm going to turn to our colleague Michael Legit for his presentation on the Innovation P3 and some of the frameworks that we've been putting together collaboratively going forward. Oh, Michael? Just the green one, yeah. There's a timer there.
Thank you for that. So I think most people in the audience are familiar with public-private partnerships. They've been developing in Canada for almost 25 years, and they become almost the default for public sector procurement of large infrastructure projects. And Innovation P3s is maybe the next thing. It focuses less on bricks and mortar and more on technology, less on trying to seek the most effective way of procuring a complex project and doing it for on time, on budget, for the least amount of cost, and more for managing complex technology projects where there's a relatively high degree of risk, both to the public sector and the private sector, in undertaking the project. So what this is the definition of Innovation P3s, and it's taken from the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnership definition of public-private partnerships, and I've changed it a bit to focus on the particular aspects of Innovation P3. So I'm going to walk you through it and then parse it down into bits and pieces to show you how that might work. And Innovation P3 is a cooperative venture between the public and private sectors, where the public sector challenges the private sector to develop new and sustainable technologies for the delivery of facilities and services needed by the public, where the public sector champions and supports private sector innovation, where the public sector and the private sector share the revenue risk and or the financial risk of innovation, and where the private sector bears the development and the delivery risk of innovation and retains an appropriate right to commercialize the data collected and the intellectual property developed. So this is a general definition for all innovation P3s, not just transit. So this parses it down into what it would look like for an e-bus innovation P3. It's, again, a cooperative venture. In this case, it's supply, maintain, operate if required, refurbish if required, and finance electric buses. The same thing for charging infrastructure, and that would include overheads or battery. The same thing for supplying the electricity for the electric buses. And finally, the collection and analysis of electric bus and charger operational data. This is how the two players play together. It's between the public and private sectors. The public sector partners, and this model is designed on a bundled procurement, so it's not just one public sector, public transit procuring for their own needs. It's a number of different public transit organizations. They're bundling their efforts into one procurement to get the critical size for the procurement to make it worthwhile, both for the public sector and the private sector. So you get one or more public sector agency owners. The private sector players are a private sector special purpose vehicle, which is a new standalone corporation. Usually it could be a limited partnership that's utilized solely for the one project. And then you have equity investors, finance lenders, as well as the critical players in actually delivering on the promise, which are the bus suppliers and maintenance contractors. Same things with the charger, and same thing with the electricity supplier. So this is how the agreement looks. There's only one agreement. There's not 5 agreements between the public sector. The public sector has one agreement with the private sector special purpose vehicle. And what I've picked on here is what the term of that project agreement might look like in the context of an e-bus public power innovation P3. It could be, for example, for a term of, for the capital cost financing amortization, it could be 7 years, which banking organizations like to do 5 to 10 years in equipment financing. Could be the life cycle of the buses prior to refurbishment, say 12 years, or it could be out over e-bus charging infrastructure life cycles, which might include e-bus refurbishing and charging infrastructure refresh. Could be as much as 20 years. All of this needs to be organized in some fashion. If you have a number of different public transit organizations all working together, you have to have some organizing agency to do that, offering up the notion that you'd have it would be procured by a special purpose procurement agency. It could be QTRIC, it could be in Ontario, Infrastructure Ontario, it could be one of the transit agencies who acts as in effect, the procuring agency. That agency would conduct the fair, open, and transparent procurement process, and it would also retain professional advisors, and that process would be overseen by a steering committee of the relevant public agencies. So this is what it looks like if you put it together in a chart. And you can see that at the top we have the public transit agencies over the side, the procuring agency. We have a project agreement going down to the special purpose vehicle. I've said project agreements before. I said one agreement, and normally you'd have one agreement, but for example, if you had 4 different public transit agencies, you'd have one procurement, you'd have one project agreement, but there might be slight differences from one transit agency to another. So you might end up with multiple different kinds of agreements, but still one procurement and one process and one set of agreements. Off to the side, the equity which is being provided to the special purpose vehicle provides the risk cushion to the public sector. And off to the other side are the lenders, whether they're equipment lenders or banks or other kinds of lenders that provides the money to finance the project. And then down below are the different contractors that are going to actually deliver on the promise. So looking at some numbers, I've just pulled these together at random to show you what numbers might look like in a bundled procurement, say of 4 transit agencies, looking at the kinds of numbers of buses and overhead chargers and so on. This comes up to 63.5 million, which is getting into the area that you need to get into to justify the costs of this kind of procurement. Looking at the different sources of funding, I haven't talked about the actual revenue that comes from operating the system. I've just focused on funding sources. There's obviously government sources of providing funding, and there's financing sources, which are obviously different to funding sources. You can all look at all different players that are involved in this process to provide this. What I've done here is a series of notes, and I'm going to leave that mostly for you to look at if you wish to. What it does is it breaks down the model and looks at different aspects of the model where you have choices to make as a public agency or indeed as a private sector player in how this procurement is going to look. Mostly what the purpose of the procurement is that with new technology offerings such as e-bus, overhead chargers, and so on, the goal is to end up with one system that works together so that the public sector can procure an output, which is e-buses, chargers that operate over a long period of time, and the private sector consortium takes the risk of providing the technology, taking the risk that it works, and most importantly, that it works together. I'll stop there.
So this is quite detailed, as you can tell, but we spent lots of months, and Michael's put in a lot of effort to help us figure out what are some of the frameworks and the models that we could actually start to use to get a coalition of the willing of cities together to utilize a P3 framework in the next 12 months to massively move forward with electric bus procurement when those cities are not Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, because those particular cities are probably going to go it alone. They're probably going to have their own initiative. They've got enough money in the kitty, and they've got enough of a big substantive team. The rest of the cities fall somewhere in between. And for them, they're going to need something like that P3 innovation framework. And so we're kickstarting that in 2 weeks with a coalition of the willing of cities meetings. And we hope to have an update on that in the next 6 weeks. City of Winnipeg will be invited to that dialogue to see what is the appetite for going into something like an innovative financing model to move things forward more quickly. So with that, we're going to turn over to our colleague, Doug Parker at IBI Group. Doug?
Okay, thanks, Josipa. Okay, so my take on this is, after first hearing in some previous sessions the overall shape of the type of innovative approach to P3s and the composition of it, I had some thoughts, I think, about some things that I thought would be, you could call them success factors. It's another way of saying like key challenges that seems like they would need to be addressed in order to get success. There we go. Okay, that's the right button. All right, so I thought a good place to start would be to just quickly introduce IBI Group, and so you have a sense of like our approach, like how innovation relates to us. So IBI Group, quickly, I'll just go through this stuff quickly, it's a global firm, all around North America and globally, about 3,000 employees, and we focus on making cities work better, I guess would be the quick way of saying it. It's a combination of 3 key sectors, the I, the B, and the I. It's intelligence work, like systems and technology related work, buildings, architecture work, and infrastructure engineering work. So I work within the intelligence sector practice, and my work over the past 30 years is as what we call transit technology. That's working with transit agencies as our clients to understand their needs and to help them assess everything that's available in technology, very broadly speaking, like any technology that could be applicable to helping them better accomplish their goals, and then to have a strategy and turn it into a program of a funded sequence of projects that are going to progress them towards that goal. And then we also help them execute those projects with specifications and procurements and testing support and adapting how the organization does things to get more out of the technologies they've bought. So in that framework, that gets me thinking a lot about, how to get the most out of technology. And it also leads us sometimes into getting involved in delivering things and doing innovation ourselves, because where the technology already exists in the marketplace, that's what we help the agencies procure and implement. And in some cases, what we do is we get involved with actually doing some systems development ourselves, and in particular some integration that pulls existing pieces of technology together into a composite that better addresses their needs. This is a big key part of an important initiative at IBI Group right now that we call the Smart City Sandbox, with these various partners. And it's a kind of basically an incubator trying to work with small innovative parties to develop solutions that we see the marketplace as needing. And just without, I won't talk about these in particular, but these are like some of our sort of suite of cloud software that addresses various needs we see in the marketplace. And I borrowed this from TTC, as you would note. So thanks to Mike McHaas and others. This would be like an earlier version, actually, of the diagram that Mike had up in his presentation. But the reason I have this here is it's a nice encapsulation of the scope and shape of the kind of technology system that we're talking about here. This is actually just one depot. So there would actually be multiple depots with that kind of composition. And then in terms of where IBI would see ourselves potentially fitting into this picture would be kind of that circle there, the energy management system. That's the kind of product that we would look at, whether there was a gap there for us to fill with innovative technology. And we do, in fact, see that need, and we are actually right now developing a product that, because we see a need for a comprehensive, large-scale integration that is vendor agnostic, and that would really serve agencies to manage the overall operation of an electrified system in all respects, and do the planning of looking at asset mix alternatives. So without talking too much about all the details here, because that would be a long talk, the key thing is that it's managing all the charging operations. It's also monitoring things in real time while the vehicles are in service. And it's managing the supply side in terms of the pricing and the right time to be buying electricity off the grid versus putting it into facility storage. And that takes to the sort of the heart of the presentation here. All that was just by way of introduction. So what I have here is really just 4 points that I'll kind of bring up in succession so we can explore them just a little bit quickly. These are the things that I see as these success factors, some overall issues, because there's some things about this type of P3 that are a little bit different than your average P3. So one thing that comes to mind right away is that the private sector needs to get motivated, to get organized and participate in something like this at the right level to make it work. And the key thing there is to get a large enough group of agencies involved so that the scale of the initiative is large enough. Next, the agencies have to be able to feel like they're going to get what they specifically need out of this, even though it's a joint purchase approach. Michael touched on that a little bit, that there could be some room for it to not necessarily be exactly the same flavor of this, that there could be a certain amount of customization. And that could be really important because, as has been said before, I mean, not every transit agency is a little bit different, even though they're all trying to accomplish the same thing. So there would be, my point is, there'd be a concern potentially going into it on the part of any particular transit agency of, well, if I'm involved in a joint purchase approach, what kind of, is that going to mean there's some compromises in terms of that I get something that kind of worked for the collective that wasn't quite as fully addressing my needs as if I had gone out and got it myself. And then the third point here is that, you know, the private sector, when they're looking at the situation, they're looking at getting payments over time in exchange for that upfront financing. And this is really an issue with any P3, but, you know, the agencies need to be convincing there. They need to be able to put the kind of guarantees in place that would have the private sector feeling like, even though it's well known that the revenue sources available to transit agencies can vary over time, that it's credible, that they're going to be able to count on getting this stream of revenues over time. And then as a final point, there's a really important issue here that the overall solution I was showing you is a composite of a large number of different vendors have to come together to create an integrated solution. You know, we might be one of them that would be interested, but we only cover one piece, and that would be the same with most other vendors involved. So a lot of different parties have to come together to form a consortium, but then in addition to that, you actually need to have multiple consortia to make this work, right? You can't just have one consortia. You don't have a competition. There needs to be a number of different consortia. So there's an awful lot of organization that's going to have to go into it. So with that, I've used my time, and thank you very much for your attention.
That's what we like to hear, that there's probably not one solution provider right now. It's probably going to be a mishmash consortium, and that gives us the sense that it's a real community effort across industry and the public sector to make this happen. So with that, we'll turn to our final speaker before we get into the panel discussion. That's Jeffrey Berger from Siemens Financial Services.
Thank you, Josipa, and thank you for Kietrich for extending the invitation to Siemens and myself with Siemens Financial Services. It's great to be here and learn more about the local market and see where we can make a difference in these activities going forward. So most of you probably have familiarity with Siemens. You hear of us as a large German engineering firm. More specifically, we have 379,000 employees worldwide, $83 billion in global revenue. We participate in the markets of over 150 countries. Specifically within Canada, we have about 4,300 employees in 35 different office locations and 14 manufacturing locations, so a strong presence within Canada as well. Now, specific to this e-mobility market, you had a presentation from Brian Pollock, one of my colleagues, on our the energy side, who's supplying the electrification for the e-mobility market. What we don't have here is representation from our commercial vehicles group that does provide electric motors and inverters that actually go onto the buses. So we supply parts to many of the e-mobility, the bus companies as well. And then there's software that's produced within Siemens that is provided to this market, often sold through those same organizations, but can be different. I know I've heard questions about the planning of what goes into the designing your depots, and Siemens offers solutions for that. I myself represent our financial services organization. We are a global organization as well, with offices in Canada as well as the US. Myself, I'm based in Irvine, California, but my business unit does participate in the project and structured finance, and that's where our P3 experience does come into play. But we offer a broad financing solutions in addition to just projects. We do leasing, which can be a solution as well for these markets. You've already heard the definition of, what is a P3, what is an innovative P3. It's really an adaptation of the project finance model that's in place for not only public offerings, but also in private projects as well. Why do you look for, P3? And primarily, it's looking at, and I'll skip to the why section of this, and it's really because it allows technologies to come to the market in a much more rapid than what might otherwise be possible given the funding constraints of municipalities and in different governments. One of the key benefits as well is really the ability to leverage the private sector's ability to get deals done on time, within budget, and meet those needs as well. I'm less familiar maybe with the Canada as far as, because I come from the US market, but I know when we give our government in the US the primarily responsibility of completing major projects on time, on budget, that is a challenge. And I would suspect it might be similar here. Finally, another thing is the P3 really does provide that budgetary stability. You, instead of planning, purchases every few years to replace buses, instead allows you to build that annual budgetary need and really fulfill it through as an operating expense almost. The other benefit is it really allows the transference of risk and the participants to take on that risk that they are most experts at. So myself, from a financing perspective, we look at it and we take and assess credit risk. You have the bus suppliers or the electric companies that would look to provide and carry that, maybe that risk of the technology, and that's where they can take part in it. And then you have maybe the local municipalities who are strong at operating and maintaining buses. They would take that position as well. This is the 3P model that I think Michael had shared with you as well. I don't see it very different in most cases. It really comes down to who are your participants and what positions they may play. You could be looking at a situation, as previously shown, that an electric provider may be an equity investor, a bus provider may be an equity investor, but typically they want to limit some of their investment to maybe their participation in the deal from a dollar size. I myself, with Siemens Financial Services, we will act as both a lender or an equity investor. We have experience in both positions. Typically, an investor won't invest as both an equity investor and as a debt lender as well. They're kind of in competing positions at times. What I have here is just a kind of a summary of the real risks that we look at on these projects, and that have to be managed by all of the participants, including the municipalities, the transit authorities. And I break those into three areas. One would be construction or technology risk. Who's best to bear that in these deals? You look at construction, that includes the charging infrastructure as well. Secondly, you have operating risk, and you want to ensure that your players in that, obviously the municipalities in this case, have the funds necessary to operate and make sure that equipment is maintained to the specifications of both the suppliers and the investors. And then finally, the financing risks. Municipalities in Canada, even in the US, in most key countries, are of very low risk from a credit default perspective. So that's not a major problem. But what as a financier you're looking for is, what is your path out of the deal? Either as an equity investor, how do you ultimately exit the deal, make sure you get your funds throughout the term of the project? And then as a lender, typically you'll be looking to get refinanced out of them, if not paid down at the end. Bus assets may be a little bit different than a rail project, for instance, or I think There was talking with a colleague here yesterday, there was a transportation shed that I think was put in Winnipeg. Typically on a facility like that, over the term of the project, they're not going to pay it off entirely. So they're going to have to refinance their debt at some point, and you want to ensure that they have a path for that. Key things that I would suggest as you're looking for 3P partners in that process when you're looking this as a solution, whether it's innovative or more of a traditional model, make sure you have that trust, confidence in the consortium of partners that you bring to the table. They need to ensure that they have financial strength. You don't want someone who comes into it and is going to run out of funds, early into the project, may not be able to complete the project on time, that they have the deep pockets and the strength to be there. Secondly, I'd almost lump these second and third points together regarding full and fair value and sensible costs. It's very important that when you look at this and you consider alternate funding sources, that they're not going to put a huge burden on your cities as an additional cost. There's limited funds, we know, for that. Make sure you have flexible contracts. My colleagues on the panel are correct in that we need to ensure a certain scale to make P3s work by bringing in maybe different municipalities into that, but it also brings in complexity. And as I think we've heard over the last couple days, every city's needs vary from city to city and on the specific technology. So those kind of things do have to be figured out during the process. And then finally, responsible budgeting. We've heard a lot of talk about the need for this funding model. I don't necessarily think that the P3 is a solution to what may be your underlying problem. I think the P3 and the attracting the investors is there. It's really about how you repay the investors and the lenders in that P3 model. Because as we've seen, the fares, the tolls, only cover a certain percentage of that. To buy new diesel buses today, we're going back and forth between the provincial and the federal government. And if that part of the equation isn't figured out, you don't have that consistent repayment plan for the P3 investors. And that is probably the bigger thing that I think needs to be figured out as part of this process. And then finally, talking about, and I know my time is running out, I'll wrap it up quickly. But as you look at some of the smaller needs, maybe you're not buying 100 buses at a time like your major cities. And so if you don't get to that scale, there are other financial solutions. Our Proterra counterparts told you about some of those things, but the battery leasing of the buses are other solutions that we and other competitors can provide in the market. And with that, you'll have my contact information should there be any other questions, and I'll turn it back to Josipa. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Well, after 2 days of technology, it's great to end talking about money, 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 money. And the reason I say that is because although I am an environmentalist, environmentally oriented, I just don't think most Canadians care about the environment. I don't think most of us actually care fundamentally about the environment. We do, but not if we have to pay for it. We do, but not if it means shrinking our car or getting rid of it. We do, but not if it means getting rid of our 2,000 square foot house and moving into a 500 square foot apartment and raising kids in an apartment. When it comes down to material assets, we like the environment, but we're not so in love with it that we're willing to pay for it in the form of lots of taxes for all of this technology that's required to get us there. And that is where we find ourselves as Canadians, which is why we're discombobulated and divided over the idea of carbon pricing or any kind of upfront investment into really substantive environmental technology and infrastructure. Hence the need for this discussion here today. If it is the case that ideologically we paint ourselves green and like to say that we're environmentalists, but financially we don't like to pay for it, how do we figure our way out of this conundrum as a country? So the first question I'd put to you as a panel is, if it's quite obvious that we're not typically willing as taxpayers to pay for all this stuff up front. Otherwise, we would have done it already, given all the talk and all the surveys about climate change and how worried we are as Canadians. Given that we're not willing to do that, why is it that P3s haven't already arisen across the country to get e-buses out the door and hydrogen fuel cell buses out the door? What's the problem stopping cities from doing this already if it's so logically the only way that we're going to get there? And I'll start with you, Michael. What is the problem with cities? Why are we not getting to P3s today to move forward with this stuff?
Is it live?
Yep.
Good. So I'm going to answer the question backwards as to how P3s have worked in other environments. It starts with the fact that you have a complex set of circumstances, and there's a reasonably high risk, and the public sector wants to push that risk to the parties that are most able to manage the risk, and that's in many cases the private sector. And in order to get that process working, you want to push that risk to the private sector, have the private sector back up that risk by putting in equity and putting in financing, and then deliver on that promise over a long period of time, whether it's 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, which brings us back full circle to how the money is played out from the public sector. In the final analysis, the public sector is going to pay for all of this. It's just a question of how they organize the process. If you look at the P3 model that I've just described, what ends up happening is that the public sector pays some money during, say, construction process. When the construction is completed, then they pay what are called availability payments during the term, sort of 20 or 30, 40 years. So the private sector only gets its money after it's delivered on its promise. So that really is the bottom line for using a P3, is that you push that risk off to the parties that are most able to deal with it, and you force them by putting them in the position of backing that up with debt and equity. So if something goes wrong, they're going to have to pay for the thing that's gone wrong rather than the public sector.
All right, and Doug?
Okay, so we're essentially asking, why is it that the type of complete and sophisticated system that would enable fleet electrification isn't already happening or already in place, because it's so important? Part of the answer, I think, is that, as we've been discussing past couple of days, the realization that this is the specific way forward is really only gelling at this time. So it's not like we've been sitting around for years understanding that this should be and definitely should be the path we're following. But I think we're here now. So it's definitely an important question. How do we get started, and how do we get started quickly? And then it gets into the complexities of the whole thing, as Michael was describing. Like I was alluding to with the success factors, I mean, there's just an awful lot of organization and hard work that's going to be needed. I mean, a consortium of agencies have to get together and decide what they would collectively want to buy, and then you have to somehow enable these various consortia to come together, and the whole framework has to be put together that makes it work. So it's important that we're starting on the right path here.
Mm-hmm. So it's a coalition of the willing of cities, and that's essentially where we've come to, is get together a group of 4, 5, 6 cities in this country, start creating a framework that they could quasi-buy into, start working with the councils to get some buy-in to the idea, and then put it out there to see what consortium of companies come together to deliver the solution. Nobody knows if it's going to work, but we're sure going to give it the college try. So we'll be back in a year to let you know, but that's essentially where you're getting at, Doug, right? And Jeffrey?
Yeah, I might also just add, I think there has to be some agreement across the local authorities, the provincial as well as the federal government, on where does some of the financial responsibilities start and stop. If you're right now arguing at times between whether it's funding from the federal government or the provincial, and all of a sudden you have a change in regimes, political parties, and you lose funding because of that, there has to be that agreement, because I think the manufacturers, the OEMs, the technology providers, as well as investors will line up rather quickly. So, but I think when you can't pay for the entire funds through that toll, you have to have agreement on where that consistency of payment will come from. Once you get that lined up, I think you have an easy process to put together.
And potentially there is a very easy solution here. I mean, arguably when we're looking at electric bus systems or hydrogen fuel cell bus systems, we contend, not just our modeling, but experience, whether it's in Toronto or other jurisdictions, that they're a lot cheaper to operate, like orders of magnitude cheaper to operate over the long term as a system play. So theoretically, there's some savings there that are so substantive that those could be baked into a repayment plan. And one of the obstacles we face at Q-Trig is just this belief at cities that really capital and operations are so divided that you can never merge the two to create a kind of package solution where operations pay off the capital in some kind of innovative financing world. So I'd like to get your feedback on that. What is the solution to overcoming this divide between capital and operations that cities typically function on that is stopping us from starting these dialogues? And Jeffrey, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the problem is that easily solved with a P3, because I think we saw some economics yesterday from Proterra colleagues that wouldn't be that different from one bus OEM to the other. The cost savings, whether it's from electricity or lower maintenance over the lifetime, help to start to equalize the cost differential between an e-bus and a conventional diesel bus, but they still don't solve that problem about the initial capital outlay. So I think that's still some area of investigation that this innovative model needs to look at a little bit further to really make it a solution that works for everything.
All right, so if I can dig into that, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience if there are on the issue of cities opening themselves up to these financing models to get this stuff out the door sooner rather than later. Here's a possibility. Let's imagine what this would look like. As an example, I'll take from real life, and I know Brampton Transit's still in the audience. When we were doing e-bus phase 1, we really had a struggle, especially in Brampton, when the utility was not willing really to help out at that time. It was in the middle of merger talks. And what did Brampton need? What Brampton needed was to basically be able to pay somebody a fee, a regular fee, to take care of the charging systems, ideally to own and operate those charging systems. And that's just one component of the system. And the ideal scenario would have been there's somebody out there that knows how to do this, there's somebody out there that has the money to do it, and there's somebody out there that's just going to charge us a fee and we don't have to worry about it and we're willing to go down that path. And the problem was there was nobody out there. There's nobody out there willing to own and operate a charging system or a set of systems on behalf of the transit system for, say, a monthly or annual fee. That's the starting nugget of what a P3 might look like. You could imagine a transit system saying, look, we got to get zero emissions in the next 20 years. In the next 10 years, the whole fleet, the whole system's got to be zero emissions, and then it's got to operate for another 10 years. Any problems, that's on you, somebody out there. But in exchange for you operating this all, we're going to pay you maybe a premium over what we would have paid had we had the cash up front. So that leads to the question, if we're going to go down this pathway and we can get to this innovative world where a city like Toronto says, hey, we need a consortium of P3 partners to come to the table, electrify our whole system, own it, operate it, run it, maintain it, and take care of any risk associated with it, and then even refurbish it as it goes along, the exchange is that we're going to end up paying more probably as Torontonians. We're going to pay the financing, we're going to pay whatever profit margin on top of it, and we're probably going to pay some risk differential for all the things that could go wrong in those 20 years. And that might actually mean higher fares because somebody's got to pay somewhere down the line. So is it the case that as we think through these P3 innovation models, that it could get all this technology out the door sooner and faster, but it's probably going to result in higher costs for the transit rider or someone down the line over the long term? Is that what we're facing? Is that potentially a fear of cities? Doug?
Yeah, I think that's part of the challenge Jeff's alluding to, is that you've got that, I mean, the P3 sector in the private sector is quite accomplished now at gathering the financing together and conducting the building of something and the maintaining of something over time. But in a lot of the more established P3s, there's some kind of a really clear revenue stream. There's a toll for a new facility that's being built. So as you say, that's not what the case is here. It's more that there are savings. There's going to be savings, and there's whatever it would take is what you're saying to pay if it had to cost a little more. But that is a little bit of a complicated situation just because you're asking the private sector that delivers your P3 to have confidence in that. They would need to have confidence in that. And some of those things are subject to external factors, right? Like when you're looking at the savings of fuel and maintenance, you stack those against the cost of delivering everything, you could maybe see an equation there. Some of those things are more certain than others, like a little bit more speculation in some things than others, but the biggest risk factor, it feels to me, is that if it's going to take an increase in fares, conventionally transit agencies don't operate independently from the political environment when it comes to fares. Normally, the matter of raising fares is something that governments get involved in and say, no, you can't raise the fares, without necessarily making the agency whole on that.
Okay, so there could be some kind of offset somewhere else in the municipal system to cover that. Michael?
So P3s are not new for public transit. When you think of most of the rail projects in Canada, they've all been P3s. You look at the light rail transit project in Montreal, you look at the regional express rail project, commuter rail project in Toronto, it's P3s. If you looked at the LRT projects right across the country, they're all P3s. If you look at the new subway projects that are being proposed in Toronto, they're touted to be P3s. So the transit sector is very familiar with P3s and how they work, and the net difference is that if you're buying, the model right now for buying buses is the municipality puts it in its budget and authorizes the transit authority to buy a certain number of buses in 1 year, and it's a one-off type of procurement. With a P3, that cost is spread out over a large number of years. Normally in the rail P3s, it goes out over 30, 35, 40 years. That same longevity could be brought to bear in e-bus P3s. The real reason for migrating a P3 project to buses as opposed to rail is this transfer of risk. With new technologies, whether it's e-bus or it's charging or whatever the componentry that goes into smart city kinds of innovations that are coming up over the next 10 or 20 years, and P3s or e-bus procurements are at the leading edge of that, there's a significant technology risk. The public sector is not in a position to bear that risk. The private sector should bear that risk. They should bear the risk of developing the product, of maintaining the product if the product doesn't work, of fixing the product, of refreshing the product, of making sure the e-bus actually works with the charger, that the two components fit together, that the electricity that's made available by the electricity supplier will provide enough electricity at the right amount of time for the e-chargers or for batteries, that it all fits together, and if something goes wrong, it's the private sector's nickel. And the P3 is a way of managing that risk and spreading the cost out over the life cycle of the product.
All right, so let's dive a little bit deeper into what risk means, because risk is a bit of a cliche word, and unless you're in the finance sector, it doesn't mean anything, and even in a general project, it means something specific to the project. So in this case, let's theorize about this. Let's imagine a P3 for, say, Brampton. Let's just say City of Brampton says it's open to a P3 to electrify its entire system. And let's say IBI Group says, we'll design this, and Transdev says, we'll operate this whole thing, and SNC Lavalin says, here's the money, and we'll build it. So we'll finance this behemoth of a thing, we'll build it out, Transdev will operate it, IBI's on the hook for the design they told us to design and build to, and there's a nice, lovely P3, and the City of Brampton pays that consortium, that special purpose vehicle, some fee over a 30-year period for the financing, the upfront build, plus whatever risk profiles in there. Well, in that case, as we've had these dialogues, with SNC Lavalin or Ellis Don, which is one of our members, they've joined our consortium because they're interested in this idea of getting into P3s because of the rail experience, because of the other things that they've designed and built and had P3s around. But the reality is none of them not one of them has experience in operating or maintaining or deploying or building or even designing electric bus garages or energy storage devices for electric transit or hydrogen fuel cell ecosystems for public transit. So it's a brave new world for them. There is a lot of risk because a lot of things could go wrong with the buses and the chargers, and guess what? SNC-Lavalin doesn't make those things, so there's a lot of risk. IBI's never done it before, so there's a lot of risk. Transdev has done it a bit, so maybe there's a little bit of risk there that they've absorbed because they have some operational experience. But what if we change that P3 and say, okay, it's not SNC-Lavalin and IBI and Ellis-Don or Transdev now. Now it's actually New Flyer, and they're going to be New Flyer buses, and New Flyer is going to finance the purchase of its own buses. And guess what? New Flyer knows its own buses. So the risk radically drops off. And we put ABB and Siemens in there, and it's ABB and Siemens chargers, and it's ABB and Siemens financing their own product. Can we get to a P3 where the risk is radically decreased because we get the manufacturers of the products to finance their own products within the P3? And then we would get rid of a lot of the risk worry over the fact that we're bringing in these big P3 players who have never played in this game. Could we do something like that? Because right now everybody's making their offerings. Nobody has a community approach to it whereby we get the manufacturers to absorb the risk of their own product lines within a 20 to 30 year contract. Would that work? I'm getting the nod from Brampton. Yay, we solved it. But would something like that work? Is that feasible? Is there an example out there of how we made the producers of products take on the risk of their own products, stand by their product? Michael?
Well, you've described the value proposition, and the one factor which you need to add to that is that it's not just one consortium, it's competing consortiums. So in any P3, what you're asking the competitors to do is, what's the result you want to achieve? You're not telling them how to do it, you're just telling them what the result is that you want to achieve, and then you leave it up to the private sector consortiums to form consortiums of the players they think they need in order to deliver on that promise and to respond to a request for proposal as to how they're going to achieve the output specification that the municipalities have put forward. So normally the way the process goes is that there's a request for information, they gather the information they need, a request for qualifications, so you find out who in the marketplace is interested, has the qualifications to play. You narrow it down to 3 consortiums. You give them the request for proposal, which is the ask, together with the project agreement, which is what the deal is going to be. You narrow it down to 1 preferred proponent. You negotiate with what the deal is. And ultimately, the public sector gets the choice, gets to name what they want, describe what they want, but not how it's going to be achieved. They get competing consortiums. They get to pick 3. They get then to narrow it down, the one that they like best of the 3.
All right, so there is an opportunity there for the city to really drive the diminution of the risk profile. Doug?
Yeah, so a key ingredient, as you're saying, Josip, is that the right participants are in the consortia to address the risks involved. And this is something that private sector consortia are very accomplished at, albeit this is a different type of delivery, but the process of seeking out and the understanding that you don't put individual participants in the consortium in the position of doing things that have too much risk. You get the right parties involved. So that just takes time and the right understanding up front about exactly what the requirements are of the delivery and enough time to actually, in this case, a little more time, to get together different than the usual players for different types of P3s. So, but all of that I don't think addresses the other type of risk that I guess we were raising, which is on the financial side, like from the perspective of the private sector consortia, they're counting on the fact that the special purpose vehicle is going to be able to make these payments. And there seem to be some particular potential challenges or risks for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. So the backer, the financial backer itself needs to be solid enough to make it through the next 20, 30 years of the entire initiative. And Jeffrey, last word?
Yeah, I would just add, it kind of brings me back to the point about having that confidence in your consortia. Because when you look to that model to really place the appropriate risks on maybe the electric provider or the charging station provider, the bus provider, the battery provider, where it is probably best measured and calculated, that level of risk, but there's also a lot of interdependence there. So I need to have confidence that my participants, my consortium partners, can deliver on their commitments, because if I fail on mine, I recognize that I've caused that, I will have some financial implications of that, but so will my partners in that process. And so that's why it's very important to make sure you have the right partners in that consortium.
With that, that's fantastic concluding comment in terms of getting to the right partners. There's an outstanding question we didn't get to today, although, we have one last question. Well, Bjorn, we're out of time, but can you ask your question quickly and we'll do the 30-second concluding comment.
In a P3 like this, how do you deal with the fact that the needs of the municipality might change from when the output specifications are written, and then how the system gets operated over the years? We deal with that with construction projects, where between output specifications and construction our needs change, and it's very difficult to get those changes. With technology changing so quickly in the electric bus field, there might be things that were not included in the output specifications because we could never envision them, but 10 years later we want those things, but they're not there. How does a P3 account for that level of risk that the municipality has to take on?
Great. Bjorn from the City of Winnipeg. In fact, we just had this conversation. It's like we're psychologically connected, Bjorn. Michael and I had this conversation a few weeks ago. With the tech moving so quickly, how do we structure a P3 that says this is what it is today, we got to get to zero emissions by this date, you got to operate and maintain, but what happens in between could be a whole lot of vagaries of technology, and this P3 consortia dragon head beast needs to be able to accommodate that within a fee structure that doesn't bankrupt the city, right? So how do we do that? How do we get there? 60 seconds each.
Well, from a process element, the importance of planning for these projects is paramount. You really have to understand what the ask should be, and you need to understand what the private sector participants expect out of the process. So you don't go into the procurement unless you have a really good understanding of what the ask is and whether the private sector will respond to it. If you make an ask what the private sector isn't happy with, they just won't respond, so the procurement won't work. Once you've done that, then the process during the P3 process accommodates changes in the procurement. There's commercially confidential meetings which are held with the procuring agents and each of the proponents, where you sit down and it's a without risk kind of session where the parties talk about the procurement, what their concerns are, where they see they need to have changes in order to stay in the game, and it allows for changes in the procurement process and in the agreement before you get to the end of the process, so you're keeping everybody in and everybody happy.
Great, thank you, Michael. Doug?
So what the private sector gets paid is, the term mentioned was availability payment. So the idea is that they're getting paid for the availability of what they provide over the entire term. So the key thing is that there's got to be metrics, very clear metrics, that are the basis for it being available. And the nature of the system is kind of what has to drive what the metrics are. So it's not just you built something and the bridge is still standing kind of thing. It's, in this case, there needs to be functional performance requirements defined. And that's really important because over the long term of this agreement, the technologies that are going to be involved in being the right technologies to deliver on what was committed to are going to change. And that's up to the private sector providers to take care of, changing the composition or deciding what's the right way to deliver on those. But the thing that makes it all work is that you're not saying it's this charger and things that are really specific. You're saying this is what it needs to be able to deliver, and the private sector can take care of adapting how that's delivered over time.
So maybe to translate it, we could say that it's not that it has to be this charger or that bus, it's that it has to be this zero emissions level or this low carbon and this efficient. So 2% downtime or 1% downtime, those are the measures. How you get there is up to you, and the risk is on you as the private sector to make that happen and switch technologies to make it happen en route. And Jeffrey, last words?
Yeah, I just agree that there's certain service level agreements you can put into the contract, but it really comes down, it's very important about ensuring that you've allowed some flexibility in those contracts, that you understand them, that you understand the financial models. Obviously, if, today's standard is a 300 kilometer bus, and all of a sudden in 5 years they come out with a 500 kilometer bus, and you want to take that technology and change your routes and how it's operated, that's probably something that's very difficult for an operator or an OEM to provide and take on that kind of risk transference. But I think there's certain flexibility, and obviously anytime, to the degree of that flexibility, it does come at a cost.
And that's a fantastic way to conclude the panel and to segue into our final panel of the day and the conference on politics and the political distribution of resources. So essentially the conclusion for the panel is we can take control as cities, we can insist on finding financial solutions, because there is money to be made in this industry and in this sector and in this transformation. And where there is money to be made, investors will come to the table. But it's up to we as the residents, the taxpayers, and the cities to dictate and bake into the arrangement and the partnership the terms and conditions we want, including the vagaries of technology, the efficiency measures, the zero carbon, the dream world that I believe we can get, because where there's money to be made, anything can be made to happen. So with that, I want to thank this panel for their insights into P3. And 1 year from now, this time, this place, hopefully we'll be coming back with some solutions that have launched in cities in innovative financing that gets us to a low carbon smart mobility world. Thank you very much.